Back when I was getting into ITX PCs a few years ago, it seemed like everyone who had a gaming build under 20 liters was going with a blower style graphics card. Not knowing any better and just taking the advice online, I did the same thing. And the reasoning there is that with a blower style graphics card, you can take all of the hot air from a small case and exhaust it out of the back near the I/O that you see here. Whereas with an open air graphics card, the common graphics cards that we see today, all of that hot air from the GPU, you're potentially just sending that back into the case and then recycling that to other components and potentially back to the GPU itself. The weird thing though is that nobody seems to be using these blower style graphics cards anymore, even in ITX cases like this. So today, that's what we're finally testing. This is a video that I've wanted to do for so long, and finally we have some thermal results to show you. This is a long video, so sit back, maybe drink a cup of coffee because there are a lot of numbers. We're finally testing, what is better? Is it better to go with a blower style card or an open air card? And how does that recommendation change based on the style of case that you go with? So like I said, it seems like we used to see blower style cards in a lot more builds and just recommended a lot more frequently. Part of that has been influenced by the fact that in 2018, Nvidia completely abandoned the blower style cooler design with the first generation of RTX series GPUs. And apart from the big investment Nvidia made on ray tracing back then, moving to a more premium open air cooler design was just as interesting in my opinion. One area that blower style cards are still heavily popular though are in pre-built gaming systems, the ones from Alienware, HP for example, especially in their smaller systems. A big reason for that is that blower style cards are generally some of the cheapest cooler designs available, not necessarily because they're the best suited for that build. So one of the biggest arguments that I've personally seen against going with an open air graphics card in a smaller case is that all of the hot air created by the GPU is just being sent back into the case, and that's being sent to the CPU cooler, the storage, the M.2 and the VRM, and potentially being recycled back to the graphics card itself. Still though, a lot of you do know that by watching my channel, I do often recommend open air cards even in space constrained cases like this. And the reason for that mainly is because open air cards are just generally a lot cooler and quieter than blower style cards in comparison. Although we do have some very interesting results to have a look at today. Now, one thing I'll note is that all open air coolers are not the same. You will need to pay attention to the fin array direction as it's not the same among all coolers. Generally, the cheaper ones will have a fin array in a horizontal fashion, meaning that the hot air will be exhausted the same way as a blower card. So the two cards that we're going to be comparing today are the GTX 1070 Founders Edition and the RTX 2060 Super Founders Edition. I understand that these are not the same GPU, and they do have a slightly different TDP as well, 150 watts versus 175 watts. Although something to keep in mind is that even between the same GPU models, open air cards do have a higher power budget compared to blower cards, so I still believe that this is a very fair and realistic comparison. For example, graphics cards like the GTX 1070 Strix or Gaming X have a TDP much closer to what we have here with the RTX 2060 Super. It also allows us to make a comparison on the changes of Nvidia's factory cooler design from generation to generation at pretty much the same TDP. I will note that the RTX 2060 Super can be found in much more premium and effective cooler designs out there. The Founders Edition is a pretty compact and small card. Just something to keep in mind when we look at the thermal and noise results. And we'll be testing these two cards across two different small form factor cases. The first is the ultra slim Sentry 2.0, a case design where blower cards are more frequently recommended, and we'll also be testing the Ghost S1. This is a case that I was really interested to see the results for because the GPU is in a completely separate chamber of the case, and so thermal performance should be independent, that is, not affecting CPU thermals and vice versa. Keyword there being should. The results here were a bit unexpected. The Sentry 2.0 on the other hand pretty much has everything in the one chamber, and the main point here is that the hot air being exhausted from an open air graphics card will potentially end up warming the air around the motherboard and the CPU cooler. So let's start with GPU thermals, with both cards running in the slim Sentry 2.0. Here we're running these GPUs in a Heaven 4.0 loop for 30 minutes with a controlled room ambient temperature of 22 degrees C. The RTX 2060 Super is in orange and the GTX 1070 is in teal. So with both cards left to auto fan speed, the open air cooler proves to be more effective, offering a 5-degree cooler result compared to the blower card. The blower card is also bumping right up against its own thermal limit of 83 degrees C. Now when we compare these results to what we get in the Ghost S1, the results are surprisingly pretty much the same. This tells us that the open air card doesn't seem to be recycling its hot air in the slimmer case, the Sentry 2.0. These results don't show the full story though. The real discussion is what happens to that hot air. Well, when we look at the CPU thermals, the Ryzen 5 3600 here, we do see around a 6.5 degree warmer result for the CPU when we're running an open air graphics card. So this seems right in line with the mainstream train of thought. At least some hot air from an open air graphics card will make its way to the CPU cooler and end up warming the result up. Although I wasn't expecting results this drastic, it does definitely make sense. But when we take a look at the Ghost S1, which if you remember has the GPU in a completely separate compartment, we oddly enough get the same result. In fact, the difference here is slightly larger, around 7 degrees C. At first, this just didn't make sense to me at all, seeing as the exhaust airflow for the open air graphics card shouldn't be making its way into the motherboard and CPU chamber of the case, but somehow it is. Something that I wanted to investigate from here was whether the higher performance of the open air card, the RTX 2060 Super, was increasing the frame rate of the benchmark loop that we were running, and hence increasing CPU utilization, load, and temperatures. Now, Heaven 4.0 is by no means a CPU intensive benchmark. That's one reason I wanted to use it for this test. We do see a very slight increase in CPU utilization when we use the 2060 Super when we look at each core individually, but it's nothing that's going to increase the CPU thermals by a massive 7 degrees C. In fact, only the first 2 cores of our R5 3600 show a significant difference in CPU utilization. The other cores show utilization that is about the same. To double check this, I tested the open air card again, but this time with the benchmark resolution set to 4K, hence reducing the CPU usage to levels closer to what we'd get with the GTX 1070 at 1440p, but we see almost an identical result for CPU thermals. Again, for those who might be lost here, we're reducing the CPU usage, but CPU thermals seem to be exactly the same and right in line with our initial result. So at this point, we can conclude that indeed the open air card is warming up the CPU by a measurable amount in both the Sentry 2.0 and the Ghost S1. I was also surprised to see that although the GTX 1070 blower card was operating extremely close to its thermal limit, the core clock wasn't throttling that bad. Of course, we do see it gradually reduce compared to where it starts at, but it's about the same amount of reduction as the open air 2060 Super and at pretty much the same rate as well. Now, blower style graphics cards get a pretty bad rap for being overly loud, and that's for a good reason, as most blower cooler designs out there absolutely suck. This is especially the case when you slap these coolers onto a power-hungry GPU and just expect that to be okay. But when comparing noise levels between our system using an open air card and the blower card, oddly enough, it's the blower card system that seems a bit quieter. The reason for this is that with the open air configuration, as you just saw, the CPU was running a little bit warmer, and so here the CPU cooler fan ends up running a little bit faster and louder. This was the same for both cases, seeing as the CPU is warmer for the open air card build, it ends up generating a little bit more noise. Had we used a quieter CPU cooler and a more premium open air 2060 Super model, we might see these noise results about even between the two. Alright, now I know that was an absolute ton of information for you guys to take in and probably confusing at some point, so let's summarize these results. So by using an open air card in a small form factor case, there's a good chance you're going to be warming up the CPU under heavy gaming loads compared to if you were using a blower card. The degree of CPU thermal increase will depend on the TDP of the GPU. For example, our 160 watt card produced about a 6 to 7 degree increase. Blower cards typically do run at their thermal limit and generally are a little bit louder than decent open air cards. Definitely keep that in mind. And lastly, in our test system, noise levels were slightly louder with the open air card configuration due to the increased CPU thermals and CPU cooler noise, but this depends heavily on the choice of CPU cooler and graphics card. So those were some very interesting results, and I'll be honest, going into the testing for this video, I really thought that the blower card would be much worse in pretty much every single test. I was also really surprised to see such a measurable difference in CPU thermals between the open air and blower card design, especially for a more open case like the Ghost S1. Now, whether you go for a blower style card or an open air card heavily depends on the type of case that you go with, or rather the size of case that you go with. For example, if you go with an ATX case or even an ITX case with a few active fans that can properly exhaust and extract the air from an open air graphics card, then I think an open air graphics card should still be your first preference. Most of the time you still will see a relative CPU thermal increase compared to a blower card, but it will be worth the trade-off for an open air card for a generally more effective GPU cooler design. But to answer the question of this video, whether blower cards are still worth using, the answer is definitely yes, they do have their place. Granted, the cooler design itself isn't a total piece of trash. We have seen those in recent times. I see blower style cards being most useful and practical in small form factor cases that don't have a lot of room for active exhaust fans. That way you prevent the heat from the GPU reaching other components like the CPU. As always guys, a huge thanks for watching. Subscribe down below if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one.